I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. We've got another slice of hammer goodness for you with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. I think it's fair to say that Hammer's Dracula series is of varying quality, but we're still at the point where you can answer the question, are you down for another bout of Christopher Lee as Dracula in a Hammer movie? With a resounding hell yes. We've not yet reached the point where Dracula is hanging around the margins of his own film like a bit player. We've certainly not yet reached the point where the band Stoneground is performing the music. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave follows on from Dracula, Prince of Darkness. And if, as I argued in my review for that movie, Prince of Darkness can be viewed from some angles as a sort of proto-slasher, then Dracula Has Risen from the Grave certainly sets the templates for a lot of 80s slasher sequels to come. We get the necessary resurrection of our villain, picking up right from when the previous instalment left off. We get a slight sense of deja vu as things unfold in pretty much the manner we'd come to expect, perhaps with a slightly reduced feel, but with the certainty that you know what you're going to get. I'm a big fan of shared continuity throughout subsequent sequels. The perfect example for me with that is Friday the 13th, 2, 3 and 4, each picking up just one long set of days that you can watch back to back. And the early Hammer Dracula movies do exactly that. We're wrong-footed at the start of Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. We're shown a victim from what transpires to be the Count's last outing in Prince of Darkness, a sort of unseen kill from that time period. And then we jump forward in time with the Count now 1 year dead, having been sent into the icy water at the end of Prince of Darkness. This is what later 80s slasher sequels learned from these Dracula movies, to tie the villain's death at the end of the previous movie to their resurrection at the start of the new one. And I personally love it. Hammer continuity isn't airtight. Sure, Dracula's castle is now a day's mountain climb away, when in the two previous films it was shown with an approach road and a sort of coach entrance. That's sort of by the by for me. He was drowned in running water at the end of Prince of Darkness, and the stream took his body down the mountain to where we find it here. He went into freezing water at the end of the last flick and is brought back out of that same state at the start of this one. And I love that kind of fidelity to previous installments that went before. It also reminds me of how the Wolfman and Frankenstein were found in ice towards the start of House of Frankenstein, after their battle at the end of Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and it looks forward to the many number of times Jason Voorhees is found in the same state that we left him at the end of the previous movie. Here, as with the previous instalment, the villagers in the shadow of Castle Dracula are still fearful of the Count, of his legacy, of his potential vengeance and influence, despite the fact that he is dead. So a visiting church monsignor decides to take the local priest up to Castle Dracula. There at the main entrance to the castle, he performs the rite of exorcism and puts a big gold cross through the front doors, barring entrance to any evil spirits, so that he can climb back down and tell the villagers, look, there's nothing now to be superstitious and afraid of. Just trust in your local friendly church. Whilst he's up there doing that, the weak-willed priest stumbles and cuts his head open, and it's that blood and his fall that cracks the ice and revives the Count. Dracula is unable to enter his church and resume his vampiric duties, so he sets out revenging himself against the Monsignor through his family. So just like previous entries and just like subsequent entries, we'll have couples, family ties, Dracula with a personal revenge mission trying to work his way through them, and typically it's a blonde that needs rescuing at the very end of it. One of the issues I do have with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave is its pacing and focus. Go-to director Terence Fisher had to bow out of directing duties because of a traffic accident, and director Freddie Francis steps into the fray, and he says he saw this film as a romance where Dracula acts as the fly in the ointment, and boy does it show. A great opening and a victim reveal from the Prince of Darkness time period, sort of unlocking a special extra secret death from that movie, leads unfortunately to interminable scenes of mountain walking, then the Monsignor's home life, slippers and all, followed by Paul and Maria's story. And I did turn to my girlfriend and say, at some point this is going to turn into a Dracula movie, right? When it finally hits his groove and Dracula hits town though, there is a lot to like. As with many of these movies, there's a young couple, a sort of young person's romance at the centre of it. This time Paul and Maria. There's lots of Pauls in these movies. There's usually the blonde that needs saving at the end, and there's also a redhead in the mix somewhere that gets killed or turned into a vampire, or both, or not necessarily in that order. So it is with Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. The old fuddy-duddy generation are all a bunch of sort of squares man, and it's the young kids that get victimised by Dracula because of the transgressions and sins of the older generation. Here, it's the Monsignor's actions in trying to exorcise Dracula's castle that bring down Dracula's vengeance upon them. So the heroine, our blonde, virginal girl in need of saving, Maria Muller, is played here by Veronica Carlson, and she really plays her character as a victim of sexual assault. And perhaps in this day and age we'd see how Dracula seduces and then visits her nightly as a sort of a form of grooming. Dracula's visitations now are even more highly sexualized. As each movie goes on, they allude less to and more blatantly say, yeah, he's whilst it's a vampire, whilst it's Dracula visiting these girls in the night and feasting off their blood, we're going to more and more closely align this to something overtly sexual, underlined in this movie with the none too subtle shot of Dracula leaning over Maria in her bed with her hand coming out of his cloak and clutching her childhood doll, and then as presumably the fangs pierce, metaphor alert, her hand opens and she throws away her childhood doll. Barbara Ewing plays Xena, our blousy and busty barmaid in the grand tradition of Hammer Barmaid. She's also our redhead, so that we know that her story arc is not going to be have as happy an ending as our blonde female leads does. Luckily, Xena the barmaid has a more interesting part to play in this movie than just more sexual female than our blonde virginal heroine, so she has to get punished for that sort of sexuality. I mean, it is there, and you'll see what you see in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. You will see in Friday the 13th sequels. Xena is more brassy, she is bold, she is much more overtly sexual, she is much more worldly, and she does get punished for it, but she's not instantly out of the picture by any stretch of the imagination. She has a role to play, and it's very interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, we get Hammer's first topless scene with the introduction of Paul, Maria's suitor and also love interest of Xena, who we're first introduced to completely bare-chested, looking almost identical to a young Roger Daltrey from The Who. So these are our young people who have to face off and try and survive the vengeful machinations of Dracula. Some survive, some don't. You'll remember that Dracula Prince of Darkness introduced the concept that vampires can be killed by running water. Dracula Has Risen from the Grave adds another little interesting line of vampire mythology to the mixture. The introduction of the concept of faith. Now, Hammer vampire films like to play fast and loose with vampire mythology and adding and taking away things for whatever they feel is going to make the film more interesting. There's no real consistency. New elements are just added to try and shake things up. So here it's not good enough to just stake a vampire in the heart with a wooden stake. You then have to pray after you've done that and believe in order for the vampire to die. And so it's too bad our hero Paul is an atheist. And if you can forgive these inconsistencies or additions to the vampire mythology, revel in them even, then you can cheer at the scene when a contemptuous Dracula, Christopher Lee, pulls a wooden stake from his own heart when Paul can't bring himself to pray to a god he doesn't believe in. The concept of faith powering the weapons of a vampire slayer is something that's picked up and run with in things like Stephen King's Salem's Lot and Fright Night. So whilst it might irk purists, I'm really happy to let it slide because other people have taken that idea and run with it and made it a real vital part of the vampire myth. Christopher Lee, of course, is back as Dracula. One of probably the most consistent complaints of the Dracula sequels from Hammer is that they don't really know what to do with Dracula. Christopher Lee doesn't always get very much to do. At least he speaks in Dracula Has Risen from the Grave. He didn't have any dialogue at all in Dracula Prince of Darkness and really not much of anything to do. Here, he's got a very focused plan, again, one of revenge on a very, very personal level. He's going to travel back to where the monsignor comes from, fuck with him through his family, get his niece? Maria's his niece, and probably turn her and make her into a bride. Basically, you made my home uninhabitable by performing that exorcism and putting that cross there, so I'm going to decimate your home as well. And he is a cold-hearted son of a bitch in this movie, deliciously so. The priest that resurrects him is weak-willed and bent to his will. Again, that's something else that Stephen King picks up and runs with Father Callahan in Salem's Lot. So this priest, I don't believe the priest is even named. He's such a weak-willed non-entity. He doesn't even have a character name. So the priest now serves Dracula. Dracula claims Xena as a victim. He feeds off her and makes her dependent upon him. Again, this grooming thing. When she loses her usefulness to him, he drains her and just leaves her on the floor, so that when the priest next comes to serve his master, and he just says to the priest, get rid of her, and this priest is now confronted with Xena's body, now turned, she's a vampire, and he has to dispose of her. I mean, it's cruel and horrible, and Dracula's plan of revenge is petty, cruel, and horrible. Christopher Lee really owns it. If he had gripes about how little he was given to do and how little from Stoker's novel was taken to characterise Dracula and the like, and we know that he did, he certainly doesn't ever let it affect his performance. And he has acolytes, not like his manservant Clove from the previous film, who is Dracula's body and soul, but newly turned acolytes who I guess are still struggling with losing, or the loss of or losing their soul. The film does dwell on the personal cost you pay when you become enthralled to a vampire. The ladies, his victims, play various shades of, as I mentioned, groomed children, abuse victims, or addicts, whilst Ewan Hopper's weak-willed priest not only prefigures Father Callahan from Salem's Lot, but gives us a mainly dialogue-free performance where you can almost see from scene to scene the ongoing contamination of his very soul. Every Hammer Dracula movie has to end with the death of Dracula. Some of the death scenes are great, some of them aren't. Dracula always suffers by not having an antagonist the level of Peter Cushing's Van Helsing from the first movie, Dracula, or Horror of Dracula from 1958, and such as it is here. Unfortunately, Dracula once again gets taken out like a punk. He has a little scuffle with Paul outside Castle Dracula, and Paul somehow manages to push him off the mountain. I don't for the life of me understand how that can possibly happen, but it leads to a phenomenal death scene. Dracula falls and lands on the golden cross that he had cast away, barring his entrance to Castle Dracula. He lands on it, and the cross goes through his back and out of his chest. Peter Jackson echoes it in his Lord of the Rings movies when he gets to kill Christopher Lee as Saruman, and you just know that Jackson is thinking, right, this is my hammer moment here, by having something pointy go through Christopher Lee and have him die on it. And here Christopher Lee gives great death. The screams, him clawing, trying to wriggle off this thing like an insect, pins to an insect board by a pin, and it's just not happening. The blood tears coming from his eyes. And again, he dies hard. It goes on for quite some time. Screams echoing round the mountains. We'll pick up on those again at the start of the next film. So whilst I absolutely do not believe that young Wei Paul can lob Dracula down a mountain, the actual death scene we get is top notch. The film looks strange though. At times it looks ethereally beautiful. At times it looks like a fairy book, and at other times it has me scratching my head a little bit. It was photographed by Alan Grant and used colour filters belonging to the director Freddie Francis, who was also a cameraman by trade, and he used those filters when he was photographing The Innocents. And it would put a sort of colour frame, not in The Innocents because that was in black and white, but here in this film then you'll quite often get a circular frame of red or orange around it, and only the centre looks normal. The edges are tinged with crimson or amber or yellow. It's not a sort I can kind of understand the thinking behind it, but it is incredibly distracting. On the flip side to that, you get a few scenes that take place amongst the rooftops of the village. That's how Paul and Maria meet each other in secret. They climb out of their bedroom windows and they have a little route through the rooftops to reach each other's bedrooms, so they can have little assignations and meetings and the like where the adults don't know about it. And these sort of closely crowded in rooftops, they make me think of Peter Pan and the chimney sweep sequences from Mary Poppins, but in a really good way, making this feel almost like a sort of dark fairy tale Disney movie at turns. It's the closest Hammer ever came to expressionism, with these rooftops and these crazy disorientating angles. I mean, they don't go full on Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but geography and geometry just go slightly out of whack in these sequences, and I really do like the grim fairy tale feel of those sections of the movie. All in all, it's not the best of the Hammer Dracula sequels, but by no means is it the worst. It's kind of a case of what you expect you're going to get from this movie, you pretty much do get, and that's kind of okay. Some of the repetition later on is going to get a little tedious. Certainly, at least here, Dracula has something to do, and that adds great weight to the film, in my personal opinion. He's not just hanging around the edges of his own movie. There is a certain case of seen it all before, seen that, done that before, but to a certain extent, after all these decades, that's almost what you want from a Hammer movie.